So if you break your arm, an X-ray gives you a very clean binary answer.
Right. It's right there in black and white.
Exactly. You look at the film, you see the jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it. It's either broken or not broken. It's visible. It's categorized. And that is, it's incredibly comforting because the solution is just obvious.
Yeah. I mean, you put a cast on it.
Right. But when you look at the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe right now, that diagnostic X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely.
We aren't dealing with clean breaks here. Today, we're navigating a diagnostic landscape that is entirely defined by historical grievances, weaponized economics, and shifting national borders.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. There is no simple binary here, like at all. You cannot just point to a single line on a map and say, well, this is where the problem starts and this is where it ends.
Right.
The history and the strategic imperatives are so deeply fused together that trying to untangle them requires looking at literally centuries of momentum.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is to trace the immense geopolitical, economic, and historical layers of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
It's a massive scope.
It is. We are tracking this all the way from a 1,000-year-old cultural linkage to the hyper-complex, completely incompatible peace plans that emerged in late 2025 and early 2026.
Yeah, the competing frameworks.
Right. We're looking at how a historical grudge effectively weaponized the modern global financial system, and how this high-stakes diplomatic chess has left the world just teetering on the edge.
And a crucial point for you listening right now, we are analyzing this completely impartially. We are unpacking the mechanics of these competing diplomatic frameworks, the strategic logic behind the military actions, and the economic fallout.
Test the facts.
Exactly. We are not here to endorse a specific viewpoint. Our objective is to give you the comprehensive architecture of exactly why and how this conflict reached its current incredibly fragile state.
So let's start pulling on the oldest thread, because if you want to understand why two radically different peace plans were clashing in 2026, you actually have to go back to the 9th century.
Yeah, all the way back.
You look at Kiev and its status as the capital of ancient Rus.
It is essential to grasp that timeline. The conceptual origins of these borders trace back over a millennium. The linkage between Russia and Ukraine is historically anchored in that 9th century state of Rus.
Right.
They share closely related languages and a deep cultural intertwining. But the institutional formalization of this relationship, the moment that truly sets the stage for the modern dynamic, that occurred much later in 1654.
Right, the 1654 treaty that united them under the rule of the Russian Tsar. It's just fascinating how an agreement from the 17th century becomes the foundational mythos for a 21st century war.
It really is.
But the identity piece gets incredibly twisted when we hit the mid-19th century. We see the emergence of a specific imperial Russian framework that was explicitly designed to absorb and, neutralize a rising Ukrainian national movement. The tripartite concept.
Yeah, the tripartite concept is a masterclass in how empires use categorization to control narratives and, suppress dissent.
Oh, for sure.
In the mid-19th century, Russian imperial thinkers realized they had a problem. Ukrainian national consciousness was growing. So, to counter this, they formulated the idea of a single tripartite Russian nation. It divided the population into three parts. You had the Great Russians, which corresponds to modern Russians, the Little Russians, which was their term for Ukrainians, and the White Russians, meaning Belarusians.
I've been trying to wrap my head around the psychology of this, and the best analogy I can come up with is a deeply toxic, forced family dynamic.
Okay, I like that. Let's hear it.
Imagine a household with three siblings. One sibling, let's call them the middle child, decides they want to move out, get their own place, and establish their own life.
Right, pretty normal.
But the oldest sibling blocks the door and says, "You can't move out. We are exactly the same person. You are just a smaller, quote-unquote, little version of me." It is an attempt to literally define away someone's separate identity, to stop them from asserting any kind of independence.
That analogy hits the underlying mechanism perfectly. Because if you convince the Little Russian that they are fundamentally just a subset of the Great Russian, then any claim to independence is no longer just a political rebellion.
Right. It's something else entirely.
Exactly. In that imperial tripartite mindset, it becomes a violation of nature. It's an unnatural severing of the self. You are criminalizing their very identity.
Wow.
But that kind of suppression creates a massive pressure cooker, and we saw that pressure violently release between 1918 and 1920.
Right, with the collapse of the Tsar's empire. The revolution led by Lenin creates this massive power vacuum, and the Ukrainians immediately seize the moment. In January 1918, they declare independence and create their own state.
They did, but that independence was incredibly short-lived. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had managed to take control over most of Russian Ukraine. However, and this is a vital administrative nuance here, that brief 2-year window of sovereignty fundamentally changed the geopolitical reality.
Because they tasted it.
Exactly. The seeds of independence were planted so deeply among the Ukrainian populace that the Bolsheviks realized they could not simply erase it. They couldn't go back to the mid-19th century tripartite erasure.
So the Bolsheviks adapt, right? They grant what is described as pro forma independence to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic.
Exactly. Pro forma meaning it existed on paper, as a matter of form. It wasn't true functional sovereignty, but the administrative recognition of a distinct Ukrainian entity was locked into the very architecture of the USSR.
Okay, so it was baked in.
Yeah, they became what was known, alongside Belarus, as the Slav core of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks built a structure that acknowledged the border, even if they controlled everything inside it. And that administrative boundary laid the exact groundwork for the ultimate trigger event of modern tensions.
Which brings us to the end of the Cold War. December 1st, 1991, the Ukrainian referendum. When we look at the data points of the 20th century, this is a massive structural hinge.
It is the moment the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted. Ukraine played a foundational role in the creation of the USSR, but it played an arguably more definitive role in its dissolution.
Wow.
On that day, in December 1991, the Ukrainian people held a democratic referendum on independence, and over 90% of the participants voted to leave the USSR.
Over 90%. That is a staggering majority. You don't get 90% of people to agree on what to have for dinner, let alone dismantling a global superpower.
Right, and that sheer volume of consensus effectively spelled the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union could not be maintained without its Slav core. It couldn't survive without the massive agricultural and industrial engine situated in Ukraine.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back on this for a second. If we have a documented, overwhelming democratic mandate from 1991 where over 90% of Ukrainians voted to leave, how does Vladimir Putin reconcile that specific data point with his current military actions?
That's the big question.
Right. Like, how do you justify rolling tanks over a border that was democratically validated by that kind of margin?
You reconcile it by reverting back to the 19th century tripartite logic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Vladimir Putin's explicitly stated view is that Russians and Ukrainians are one people who share a single historical and spiritual space. In his ideological framework, the emergence of a wall between them in recent decades is a tragedy.
So he just rejects the vote entirely.
Exactly. He does not view the 1991 referendum as a legitimate expression of national will. He views it as an unnatural anomaly, a temporary mistake that severed a single spiritual entity.
So for the Kremlin, the historical perspective isn't just an interesting background document. It is the active operational justification for 21st century warfare.
Precisely. And that historical ideology collides violently with the cold, hard facts of geography and geoeconomics. We have to look at the map.
Yeah, the physical reality of it.
Right. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, right behind Russia. It shares borders with 4 NATO countries. It commands highly strategic ports on the Black Sea. But more importantly, it is the physical bridge for European energy.
Right, the pipeline leverage. Europe depended on Russia for roughly 1/3 of its natural gas. And a massive portion of the pipeline infrastructure that delivers that gas passes directly through Ukrainian territory.
Think about the strategic vulnerability that creates for Moscow, your primary source of economic leverage over the entire European continent. Your ability to turn off the heat in winter relies on physical infrastructure located in a country that just voted 90% to leave your sphere of influence.
That is a massive liability for them.
Huge. Controlling that Ukrainian territory, or at least ensuring it remains a compliant buffer state, isn't just about historical pride. It is about locking down the physical mechanisms of Russian geoeconomic power.
So we have this highly volatile mix, a 1,000-year-old cultural claim, an imperial mindset that refuses to acknowledge Ukrainian independence, and the immense strategic reality of gas pipelines and Black Sea ports.
It's a powder keg.
And all of this is sitting right on the edge of a rapidly shifting post-Cold War security architecture.
And the expansion of that security architecture is what transforms this regional tension into a global crisis. Since the early 1990s, NATO has steadily expanded eastward, absorbing 14 new member countries, including several that were formerly part of the Soviet sphere.
From Moscow's perspective, they view this expansion as a direct breach of non-threatening commitments they believed were made in the early 90s. They see the security map of Europe creeping closer and closer to their borders.
The strategic anxiety in the Kremlin rises with every new accession. But the true geopolitical lightning rod is the status of Ukraine itself.
Right, because of what happened in 2008.
Exactly. Since 2008, Ukraine was assured that it would eventually be able to join NATO.
Which is, frankly, the worst possible gray zone to be in. You get the invitation to the VIP club, which enrages the people outside, but you are left standing on the sidewalk without the bouncers to protect you.
That's a great way to put it.
They had the promise of membership, but not the actual Article 5 mutual defense umbrella.
That eventual assurance provoked Russia's maximum hostility while providing Ukraine with minimum security. And this fragile dynamic shattered in 2014.
Right, the Maidan Revolution.
Yes, a pro-Russian president in Ukraine was removed from power. Following that, Kiev tilted decidedly toward the west. They began conducting joint military exercises with NATO. They started receiving Western armaments, including U.S. anti-tank missiles.
But Kiev argues that this pivot to the west and this sudden need for armaments was a matter of pure survival, because 2014 is the year Russia directly intervened, right?
Yeah.
Annexing the Crimean Peninsula and throwing support behind separatists in the eastern Donbass region.
That intervention marked the beginning of an 8-year multi-domain campaign by Vladimir Putin to force Ukraine back into the Russian orbit.
8 years of buildup.
Exactly. From 2014 to 2022, we didn't just see conventional military skirmishes, we saw a comprehensive strategy. Direct military intervention, devastating cyber attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, massive disinformation operations, severe economic pressure, and relentless coercive diplomacy.
Coercive diplomacy is a very sterile academic term for what was essentially geopolitical extortion.
Pretty much, yeah.
And that 8-year pressure cooker reached its absolute boiling point in mid-December 2021. Russia decided to put its cards on the table. They handed Western powers a very specific list of demands, a written guarantee they required to de-escalate the situation.
Those December 2021 demands are crucial because they map out Russia's maximum strategic objectives. They didn't just want minor concessions. They demanded a fundamental rollback of the European security order.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, an absolute halt to any further eastward expansion of NATO.
Second, the removal of NATO troops from Poland and the Baltic states, which is essentially asking NATO to abandon its own members and roll back the clock over 2 decades.
Third, the withdrawal of all U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe. And fourth, which is identified as the absolute core of their demands, a binding legal guarantee that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO.
Looking at those 4 demands, that is asking the West to voluntarily dismantle its own security architecture.
Completely.
The 2 sides went to Paris. You had interlocutors from France, Germany, the U.S., and Russia sitting at the table. But there was no breakthrough. It's a total diplomatic failure.
When a state employs maximalist coercive diplomacy and the opposing side refuses to capitulate, the cause and effect chain of international relations dictates that kinetic action is the next step.
So war was inevitable at that point.
The failure to secure those written guarantees in Paris directly precipitated the invasion sequence.
It moved incredibly fast. On February 21st, 2022, Vladimir Putin makes a unilateral legal move. He officially recognizes the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, the DPR and LPR, as independent states.
That recognition was the engineered legalistic pretext. By declaring those separatist regions in eastern Ukraine to be independent nations, Russia could then authorize the deployment of its own military forces into those areas under the guise of an invited peacekeeping mission.
A peacekeeping mission.
Right. It was the final administrative step before the kinetic trigger.
And then, in the early hours of the morning, the kinetic trigger is pulled.
Yeah.
Russian forces launch a full-scale, multi-front invasion of Ukraine, land, air, and sea.
The transition from a 9th century cultural linkage to a 21st century mechanized invasion is complete. And it brought with it an immediate, devastating loss of life, primarily falling on the Ukrainian people.
It's just tragic.
It is. This conflict, as of the timeline we are analyzing in late 2025, has ground on for nearly 4 years.
But the immediate response to that invasion wasn't just about sending anti-tank missiles or ammunition. The global response fundamentally redefined how wars are fought. Because if a military advance stalls, how do you fight a war without firing a bullet?
You go after the money.
Exactly, you go after the money. And the global financial architecture was instantly weaponized.
The geo-economic response from the US and European nations was designed to be crippling. They didn't just condemn the action, they actively sought to dismantle the economic engine capable of driving a multi-front war.
So where do they hit them first?
The initial strikes targeted the sovereign debt of Russia and its major financial institutions, specifically including its military banks.
But they went so much further than just targeting specific banks. They froze Russia's central bank assets. I really want to unpack the sheer scale of this. You were talking about blocking a sovereign nation from accessing its own foreign reserves.
It was a monumental, paradigm-shifting move. Modern nations keep hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign currency reserves, euros, dollars, yen stored in institutions around the world to stabilize their own currency and economy.
Right, like a national savings account.
Exactly. By freezing those central bank assets, the West effectively locked away a massive portion of Russia's national wealth overnight. They separated the state from its own rainy day fund right as the storm began.
And energy infrastructure, which we noted earlier was Russia's greatest point of leverage, instantly became a casualty of this economic warfare.
Yeah.
Germany made an incredibly painful, massive decision regarding the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Nord Stream 2 was an $11 billion natural gas pipeline built across the Baltic Sea owned by Russia. It was completed and waiting for final approval. Halting it was a seismic geo-economic shift.
Because Germany needed that gas.
Desperately. It signified that Europe, led by Germany, was willing to endure significant domestic economic pain to decouple from Russian energy. They severed the very leverage Putin had spent decades building. An $11 billion geopolitical asset instantly became stranded steel at the bottom of the ocean.
But the most famous, and perhaps most misunderstood economic weapon deployed was the SWIFT ban. We hear this acronym constantly, but it requires a real deep dive to understand why it's so lethal. What exactly is the SWIFT system?
SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It is the central nervous system of global finance. It connects more than 11,000 financial institutions across over 200 countries. It is based in Belgium and overseen by central banks from 11 major economies.
I always like to clarify this because people imagine SWIFT as a giant vault where all the world's money sits. But SWIFT doesn't actually move a single dollar, does it? It's not an armored truck. It is essentially a highly secure, globally authenticated messaging app.
That is exactly right. If a bank in London needs to send $50 million to a bank in Tokyo, the money doesn't physically travel. The London bank sends a highly secure encrypted message via SWIFT to the Tokyo bank stating, "We are debiting our account, you credit yours."
Okay, that makes sense.
SWIFT is the underlying mechanism of trust. It allows global finance to operate at instantaneous speed without constantly verifying the legitimacy of every single transaction.
So when the West decides to cut Russia off from SWIFT, it is the equivalent of restricting a country's internet access, but specifically for the financial world. You are unplugging their financial router.
The intention is absolute isolation from the international financial system. If your banks cannot send or receive those secure messages, your international trade literally grinds to a halt.
You can't buy or sell anything.
Right. You cannot easily get paid for the oil and gas you export, and you cannot easily pay for the microchips and manufactured goods you need to import.
To understand the potential impact, we have to look at precedent. Has the global community ever pulled the plug on a country's SWIFT access before?
Yes. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Iran was the only country that had been cut off from the SWIFT network.
Oh, wow. Just Iran.
Just Iran. And the economic devastation was severe. When Iran was disconnected, they lost roughly a third of their total foreign trade revenue almost immediately.
A third of all foreign trade revenue vanishing just by turning off a messaging app. So connect the dots for us here. How does freezing central bank assets and unplugging a country from SWIFT directly impact their ability to sustain troops on the ground in a multi-front invasion?
It comes down to the burn rate. War is the most expensive endeavor a state can undertake. You must pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers, manufacture complex munitions, maintain vast supply lines, and simultaneously try to stabilize your domestic economy to prevent unrest.
So it's about starving them out.
Exactly. By freezing foreign reserves and cutting SWIFT access, the West engineered a scenario to starve the Russian war machine of the external capital it desperately needs to replenish itself. It forces Moscow to burn through its domestic resources at a highly unsustainable rate. It is designed to turn a quick military objective into a fatal long-term economic bleed.
But here's the stark reality. Despite the frozen assets, despite the SWIFT bans, and despite the fierce military pushback from Ukraine, the war ground on.
It did.
By late 2025, the conflict had reached a brutal, exhausting stalemate. Which brings us to the most dense, critical, and fascinating part of our analysis today. We are looking at the competing peace architectures of late 2025 and early 2026.
This is where we transition from military strategy to high-stakes diplomatic game theory. We're looking at two wildly contrasting visions for the future of Eastern Europe. The November 2025 plan proposed by U.S. President Trump and the January 2026 updated formula from Ukrainian President Zelenskyy.
Let's start by dissecting the Trump plan from November 2025. It is a highly structured 28-point framework. The drafting of this plan was heavily influenced by Trump envoy Steve Witkoff and notably involved Russian participation and consultation via Kirill Dmitriev.
The underlying philosophy of this 28-point plan is fundamentally transactional. It proposes a grand trade. Ukraine makes enormous defensive and territorial concessions. In return, they receive an end to active hostilities, massive reconstruction funds, and a specific set of alternative security guarantees.
But it's a huge shift in power.
Yes. Make no mistake, the mechanics of this plan shift the regional balance of power significantly toward Russia.
Let's get granular on the territory because the concessions are massive. Under the 28-point plan, Ukraine would be forced to officially cede or accept the demilitarized Russian-controlled status of vast swaths of its internationally recognized land.
We are talking about the entire Donbas region.
Right, the Donbas, the Crimean Peninsula, and significant portions of the Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts.
To contextualize that, this framework asks Kyiv to legally relinquish its claim to its industrial heartland and its primary southern coastal access.
That is a lot to give up.
It is. In exchange, the plan states that Ukraine's remaining sovereignty is recognized, quote-unquote, in principle. However, that sovereignty comes with severe non-negotiable caveats regarding its military posture.
And those military limits are draconian. First and foremost, an absolute ironclad ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO. Furthermore, the plan forcibly caps the size of the Ukrainian armed forces at approximately 600,000 troops.
Right, a hard limit.
And a central pillar of the U.S. framing here is a strict prohibition on the deployment of any foreign allied troops on Ukrainian soil.
Think about the strategic autonomy that is lost here. Ukraine is permanently blocked from the only alliance NATO that could guarantee its long-term survival. Its domestic army is artificially capped, regardless of future threats, and no allied forces can be stationed there as a deterrent. They are rendered permanently vulnerable.
But the U.S. plan does offer a security guarantee framework to replace NATO. Correct. It's not just leaving them entirely exposed.
It offers a framework, yes, but it is steeped in ambiguity. Russia would formally commit to non-aggression. However, without the enforcement mechanism of NATO's Article 5 backing, the guarantees are incredibly fragile.
It's just a promise, then.
Basically, it relies on the word of a state that just spent 4 years dismantling the previous security order.
Let's look at the timeline and the financial engineering of the Trump plan, because this is where it gets really complex. The plan envisages rapid elections taking place in Ukraine within roughly 100 days of the agreement signing.
Very fast.
It establishes a peace council, which will be chaired by Trump or led by the U.S. to oversee the transition. But the reconstruction aspect is just wild.
It is a remarkable piece of geoeconomic maneuvering. The proposal suggests taking those billions of U.S. dollars of frozen Russian state assets, the central bank reserves we discussed earlier, and channeling them directly into rebuilding Ukraine.
So making Russia pay for it, essentially.
Yes. This is positioned as the financial sweetener for Kyiv's territorial losses. Alongside this, the plan outlines a clear path for Russia to return to the G8, a systematic easing of the Western sanctions, and broad sweeping amnesties for wartime actions.
So if I'm summarizing the November 2025 Trump plan. You give up massive territory, you cap your military, you stay out of NATO forever, and you hold rapid elections.
Right.
In exchange, the bombing stops, you get billions in frozen Russian money to rebuild, and Russia gets welcomed back into the global economy.
That is the transactional reality of the 28 points. Now, we must contrast that directly with the framework issued on January 14, 2026. This is President Zelensky's updated 20-point peace formula.
And it is completely different.
Entirely. It represents a massive, unyielding strategic pivot. It builds on the idea of U.S. mediation, but it absolutely flatly rejects any form of territorial capitulation.
The contrast is night and day. Where the Trump plan focuses on managing concessions, The Zelenskyy plan prioritizes ironclad, sovereignty-preserving security guarantees.
Let's start with how Zelenskyy handles the NATO problem.
Okay.
Since full NATO membership is the absolute red line for Moscow, Zelensky's plan demands an alternative. 15 to 50-year American defense pacts that are modeled explicitly on NATO's Article 5.
It is a brilliantly aggressive legal workaround. Kyiv is essentially saying, fine, we won't officially join the NATO bureaucracy tomorrow, but we demand the exact same. An attack on one is an attack on all, binding guarantee directly from the United States, locked in for up to half a century.
And they don't stop there. The 20-point plan calls for massive European arms stockpiles to be created and for rapid reaction forces to be permanently stationed outside Ukraine's borders, ready to intervene instantly if Russia breaches the agreement.
So they're armed to the teeth.
Exactly. Furthermore, it refuses to close the door on Western integration. It explicitly preserves Kyiv's eligibility to eventually join NATO and fast-tracks European Union integration over a strict 10-year horizon.
They are refusing to be relegated to a permanent buffer state. What about the territory, though? The Trump plan required ceding the Donbas, Crimea, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. How does Zelensky's framework handle the map?
The approach here is described as territorial pragmatism. Instead of formally giving up land, the 20-point plan proposes heavily monitored buffer strips along the current contact lines. This includes reciprocal pullbacks in the highly contested gray zone pockets of Donetsk.
Notice the phrasing there, right? Reciprocal pullbacks. It demands that both sides withdraw forces, creating a genuine demilitarized zone rather than just Ukraine retreating.
Precisely. Crucially, the plan demands that Russia entirely evacuate from its peripheral encroachments in the Kharkiv, Sumy, Mykolaiv, and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts.
And it directly addresses the critical infrastructure. It demands a binding UN-mandated administration of the Zaporizhia nuclear facilities, the ZNPP, to prevent nuclear blackmail. It also requires the revival of the destroyed Kakhovka reservoir under the supervision of neutral inspectors.
Now let's compare the financial architectures. Both plans leverage the frozen Russian assets, but their methodologies are entirely different.
Under Zelensky's plan, there is no grand bargain to ease sanctions. It hinges Ukraine's economic revival on forcibly channeling over $300 billion in immobilized Russian reserves, specifically into hardening Ukraine's power grid and rehabilitating its vital shipping ports.
And it also demands perpetual, guaranteed Black Sea navigation rights for the export of grain and metals.
And then there is the proposal regarding the Donbas industrial belts. This is perhaps the most sophisticated geoeconomic strategy in the entire document.
It really is fascinating.
The Zelenskyy plan proposes establishing special economic enclaves in the contested Donbas regions. These enclaves would remain firmly under Ukrainian jurisdiction, but they are explicitly designed to entice neutral investment from BRICS, plus partners, countries like India, Brazil, or South Africa.
It is a geopolitical trap for Moscow. By inviting BRICS plus money into the Donbas, Ukraine is binding the economic interests of neutral nations to the stability of Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Right. If Russia decides to shell those industrial belts again, they aren't just hitting Ukrainian factories.
Right.
They are blowing up investments owned by the very non-Western allies Russia relies on.
Exactly. It forces neutral countries to actively care about maintaining Ukrainian borders.
It is a brilliant use of economic gravity to create a security deterrent. Let's look at the justice and diplomatic mechanisms of the 20-point plan.
Sure. The preamble anchors the entire agreement on a reaffirmation of the Global Non-Proliferation Treaty. It calls for a binding Moscow-Kyiv non-aggression treaty that is actively policed by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
And regarding the timeline for elections, they completely reject the 100-day rapid timeline proposed by the Trump plan. Ukraine insists on holding prompt elections only after martial law is fully lifted.
Which makes sense from a security standpoint.
Right. They argue that fixed, rapid timelines, while the country is still heavily destabilized, would heavily favor Russian election meddling and disinformation.
Finally, we must look at the humanitarian and legal tracks. The Zelenskyy plan demands comprehensive prisoner swaps, the immediate repatriation of over 19,000 deported Ukrainian children, and crucially, a strict war crime carve-out from any proposed amnesties.
No blanket immunity.
None. They demand that international criminal court probes proceed completely unhindered. There is no blanket immunity here.
So, active recall moment. Let's put these two plans side by side. If you are tracking the sanctions and the money under the Trump plan, there is a major lifting of sanctions, an unfreezing of assets for Russia, and a path back to the G8.
It's an intentional easing of the economic blockade to buy peace.
But under the Zelenskyy plan, Those $300 billion in immobilized reserves go strictly to Ukraine's rebuilding, with absolutely no promise to lift sanctions on Russia and a demand for ICC war crime tribunals.
That is the fundamental divide, and we must also briefly state Moscow's maximalist demands, which hovered over all these negotiations.
All right, what did Moscow want?
Moscow demands full legal control over all the disputed regions, recognized internationally as Russian forever. They demand an explicit constitutional guarantee that Ukraine never joins NATO. And they require a broad, all-encompassing amnesty that provides de facto legal immunity for Russian leadership and military forces.
As the analysis plainly summarizes, the 28-point Trump plan spells a form of strategic defeat for Ukraine through permanent territorial cessions and strict military caps. The 20-point Zelenskyy plan offers sovereignty-preserving, heavily armed security guarantees, and Moscow's demands equate to total, unconditional capitulation.
We have three fundamentally incompatible architectures for the future of Eastern Europe. And this collision of frameworks naturally led to intense friction, not just across the negotiating table, but deep within global alliances.
Which brings us to the global reactions, the institutional fault lines, and the new escalation. How did the world actually react to the unveiling of the November 2025 Trump plan?
Volodymyr Zelensky's government reacted with a highly calibrated mix of diplomatic caution and fierce resistance. While publicly stating a willingness to work constructively with U.S. mediation, Ukrainian officials flatly, unequivocally rejected any version of the deal that forced them to relinquish sovereign territory or accept humiliating military caps.
The phrase that kept appearing in the commentary is the Munich model of appeasement.
Yes, a very heavy comparison.
They are directly comparing this framework to the 1938 Munich Agreement, where European powers ceded Czechoslovak territory to Nazi Germany in a desperate, failed bid to prevent a wider war.
It's the heaviest historical comparison you can invoke in Europe. Ukraine's position is that any peace must preserve territorial integrity. Otherwise, it simply rewards aggression.
Right.
They are insisting on being an active co-signatory with agency, not a subordinate state being handed a predetermined deal manufactured by external powers. They refuse to be locked into a vulnerable security posture just to provide a political win for mediators.
And what about the European Union and broader Western partners? How did they react to the U.S. proposal?
With profound caution and deep strategic anxiety. The primary European concern is that the 28-point plan is simply far too generous to Russia. By legally consolidating territorial gains achieved through invasion, the plan violates a foundational European security principle. The principle that war cannot pay and that international borders must not be changed by force.
Because if you validate that principle in Ukraine, every other border in Europe suddenly looks a lot softer. There is also a massive strategic dilemma for the EU playing out behind the scenes here. They are highly aware of the shifting U.S. posture under a Trump administration. If Washington is using this peace plan to wind down its own financial and military involvement, essentially shifting the burden of European security entirely onto European shoulders, the EU is left holding the bag.
And Europe knows that if the U.S. pushes ahead unilaterally and the European continent is divided on how to respond, the underlying credibility of Western security guarantees collapses. It fractures the cohesion of both NATO and the EU.
So what do?
This is why key European states firmly insisted that economic sanctions should not be lifted prematurely, and they began scrambling to prepare their own counterproposals through what they termed a coalition of the willing.
So paint the picture of late December 2025. We have an incredibly fragile, hyper-complex diplomatic moment. The U.S. envoys are pushing their transactional plan in Geneva. Ukraine is actively resisting while trying to keep the U.S. engaged. The EU is scrambling to form a coalition to protect their own security architecture.
The tension is at an absolute maximum.
Right. And then a single trigger event collapses the entire house of cards.
In late December 2025, right in the middle of these delicate, multinational, institutional maneuverings, Russia releases a shocking official claim. They announced that Ukrainian military drones had directly targeted President Vladimir Putin's official residence at the Kremlin.
A literal strike at the absolute center of Russian imperial and state power.
Yeah.
Now, it is crucial to note that Ukraine, along with Western intelligence agencies, strongly and immediately denied the claim. But in geopolitics, the objective truth of the event often matters far less than the calculated reaction to it.
The reaction was the point. The immediate diplomatic fallout was devastating. Moscow used the alleged drone strike to harden its stance instantly. The Kremlin, and specifically Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, issued severe warnings. They announced that in light of the terrorist act, Russia would revise its negotiating position entirely and prepare overwhelming military responses.
The current reality we are left analyzing is grim. That single drone incident, whether real, intercepted, or a fabricated false flag, was enough to sharply reduce any near-term prospects for peace. The trajectory shifted overnight from a complex, heavily debated de-escalation framework right back toward an intensifying, brutal war.
It perfectly tragically illustrates the profound fragility of peace processes. You can spend months drafting 28-point plans, coordinating with global envoys, debating the legal mechanisms of billions in frozen assets, and structuring 50-year defense pacts.
And it just goes up in smoke.
And all of that institutional momentum can be completely obliterated overnight by a single claimed escalation.
It is breathtaking how quickly the vast machinery of global diplomacy can just freeze solid. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's take a moment to recap the massive historical and strategic ground we've covered.
We have traced a continuous, unbroken line of conflict. We started by examining a 9th century cultural and territorial link in ancient Rus. We saw how a mid-19th century imperial tripartite mindset attempted to legally and culturally erase Ukrainian identity.
Right. We tracked how that suppression led to the brief independence of 1918, the Bolsheviks' reluctant pro forma recognition, and the definitive world-changing 90% vote to leave the USSR in 1991.
We looked at the hard geographical and energy realities, the immense natural gas pipelines that gave Moscow its primary leverage over Europe. We examined the 14-country eastward expansion of NATO, the dangerous 2008 promises that left Ukraine in the gray zone, and Putin's 8-year multi-domain coercive campaign from 2014 that ultimately culminated in the maximalist December 2021 demands and the full-scale kinetic invasion in February 2022.
We analyzed the unprecedented paradigm-shifting geoeconomic response, the freezing of hundreds of billions in sovereign central bank assets, the willing sacrifice of the $11 billion Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and the weaponization of the SWIFT messaging system to starve the Russian war machine of its vital foreign trade revenue. And finally, we broke down the extraordinarily complex competing roadmaps for survival and sovereignty in 2025 and 2026. The 28-point Trump plan, which proposed trading sovereign territory and accepting military caps in exchange for reconstruction funds and a Russian return to the G8. And the 20-point Zelenskyy plan, which demanded Article 5-style 50-year pacts, territorial buffers, BRICS, plus economic enclaves, and the use of $300 billion in Russian assets to rebuild, all of it derailed by a late December drone claim at the Kremlin walls.
As we conclude this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final reflection on the fundamental nature of the international order itself. If the core principle that international borders must not be changed by military force becomes a negotiable commodity in exchange for a temporary cessation of hostilities, how do you possibly build a lasting security architecture for the rest of the world?
It's a huge question.
When the mechanisms of global trust and finance are completely weaponized, how does the global community ensure that war cannot pay? If the foundation of international law is treated merely as a starting point for a transactional geopolitical trade, we may be entering an era where sovereignty is only guaranteed by the size of your military and not by the ink on a treaty.
That is a chilling thought to mull over. It brings us right back to where we started. When you look at the X-ray of this conflict, there are absolutely no clean breaks. The diagnostic waters aren't just muddy, they are turbulent, they are deeply historical, and they are rising. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this immensely complex issue. Keep looking at the news, the maps, and the peace plans through this new historical and strategic lens, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.